Hello, BookTube. I want to do a little discussion video today about a controversy that has embroiled the bookish community lately on BookTube and social media, that has filled me with so much bile, vitriol, and phlegm that I'm going to need not one but two videos to address it all. Although I'm not completely sure that some of the phlegm isn't due to this viral thing that just doesn't want to leave me, but it sounded better the first way. And I want to give a bit of recap for those of you who might have been very sanely avoiding the whole thing. And it involves a new novel by Veronica Roth, New York Times bestselling author of the Divergent series. A couple of months ago, she brought out a new novel called Carve the Mark, which is a fantasy about two groups of people on a planet, one of which is golden-haired and civilized and refined, and the other of which is curly-haired and tribal and aggressive. And the usual hijinks ensue. And when the book came out, a whole bunch of high-profile booktubers, people with multiple tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of subscribers, were sent advance copies so that when the book came out, they could be part of the hype with sponsored videos. And in the wake of that first wave of reaction, the book went on the New York Times bestseller list, and there was a second wave of responses to the book from bloggers and some booktubers pointing out that the basic tenet of the story is a little derivative and could be construed as the trope of the dark-skinned aggressive other. That is it's a little bit of a mouthful, but still, the idea that there will be a tribal, guttural, violent, dark-skinned race that either needs defeating or that needs saving from itself by someone who's light-skinned and more refined. And I didn't find a lot of sense in that, especially since the blog post that seemed to be at the heart of it all revealed its bedrock idiocy by using as its example J.R.R. Tolkien's orcs from The Lord of the Rings. But up until that point in the whole thing, nothing had happened to get Steve's goat, because as much as I might think that people under the age of 35 really shouldn't use the word trope, and as much as I might think, if you only read books written for children and you don't know anything about Uncle Tom's Cabin or Sula or anything like that, if you don't know anything about anything except this tiny little puddle of genre fiction, maybe you don't start slinging around universal truths. That might have irritated me a little, but nevertheless, written and spoken criticism of the dark-skinned, aggressive other, as pat as it might seem to me, is a form of literary criticism. It is a literary response to a written work. That's fine. I saw that and thought, okay, it's a little shrill, it's a little virtue signaling, but it's worthwhile. It's certainly interesting. How much of this really is going on in the book, and is it overt? Is it gonna hit you over the head? In fact, I read a lot of that stuff before I actually read the book, and so I went into it, I admit, with my interest raised, and then the whole controversy finally did take the almost certainly inevitable step that would be necessary to crank Steve's engine, and that is when there was a small group of people who were outraged by the whole overtones of racism, the whole dark-skinned, aggressive other thing. And there was an even smaller subgroup of that small group who were the fascist bullies. There'll always be a small subset of any group that are the fascist bullies. The people who don't really care about the issue, they only care about exercising power and getting their way. That's the only thing that fascists care about. I know what you want, and I want to make you do something else. I want to make you do what I want. And they hopped on the bandwagon of the dark-skinned, aggressive other and started calling Veronica Roth a racist and demanding that she apologize and promised to do better. And they had first blood in that kind of fight, as absurd as it might seem to the rest of us, because the same kind of baying and witch hunting was done to V.E. Schwab, a fantasy author, and she caved. She said, I'm really sorry. She groveled in apology. She said, I'll try to do better next time. Better in this case, meaning I'll try to do what you tell me to do so you don't get mad at me. That kind of furor started growing up around the whole thing and started being directed at Veronica Roth. It didn't damage her New York Times best-selling status at all. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it increased it. But eventually, she did something I wish she hadn't done. I really wish that authors would simply ignore that tiny fraction of fascist bullies. I really wish they would just ignore them. The high ground is theirs. The majority of us don't want our authors being dictated to. If they write something you don't like, okay, have at it or ignore it. But you don't go to the author's home and say write something different. That I wish that authors would just ignore them, but Veronica Roth decided not to. She decided to do an Instagram post, I think it was, a blog post, in which she anatomizes some of her sources of inspiration for Carve the Mark. That's the name of the book. She analyzed some of her sources for it, some of the areas of her inspiration. She shouldn't have done it. No author should ever do that. No author should ever have to do it or feel compelled to. But the snark in her defense was that, of course, none of her inspirations that she's aware of were racist. None of them were anything like what all of her detractors were saying. And she also pointedly, because she was pointing that out, she pointedly refused to apologize. And that just stoked the fires. People saying, well, you could be racist and not know it, or you're lying, or how dare you not apologize, etc., etc. And that got me going. That I have seen before. That verges on this whole topic of representation in fiction, of problematic novels that are problematic because they foster stereotypes or they foster racism or soft racism. That gets me going because there are a lot of people who think that way. There are only a handful of people who think that way and want to enforce it. But I think there are still a lot of people who do think that way, and I want them to stop. It is a very juvenile way to think. It equates a work of fiction with a face-to-face conversation in a high school cafeteria. If you're in a face-to-face conversation with someone in a high school cafeteria and they make a soft, racist comment or a microaggression or a privileged comment, you can, if you're the mother of all prigs, call them on it. You can say, Naomi, I really don't think you know what you're saying right now, but it's very offensive to me. It hurts me. You can do that just fine. It's a face-to-face conversation in a high school cafeteria. Books are a different thing. Books are out in the world. They are works of creativity. They are separate from their author, and they are separate from you. And also, I might add here, just as a parenthetical, because it gets lost in the noise, books can't hurt you. At all. Period. I don't want to hear anything about kinds of hurt. I don't want to hear anything about it can't hurt you, but they can hurt me. Books can't hurt you. If you think books can hurt you, you've never been hurt. And you should shut your mouth and count your blessings. That's just a side thing. Main thing is, the whole practice of reading fiction is premised on the fact that a book is out there in the world. It's its own thing. You don't need the author's input anymore. You don't need the author's permission. You don't need the author's 2 cents worth. The author's interpretation of the work means nothing more than anyone else's does. More than yours does. You make an interpretation and you back it up, and that's that, and it's a work of literature. It sits on library shelves. It affects people in all kinds of different ways. If you cross that line and start viewing it as a conversation with someone in a high school cafeteria and telling them to stop and apologize and do different, you're taking a lumberjack's axe to the live wood of the reading experience. And you should stop. If you realize, if you had pointed out to you that you were doing high school behavior and totally misconstruing what fiction is, if you realize that and you continue to do it, you are, what's the scientific term? A moron. And you should get out of the book world right away and find a different hobby, a less demanding hobby. and leave the rest of us alone, because we don't want you to affect reading that way. We don't want you to affect books that way. We were all disappointed in an author apologizing to you for your bullying. that was my first reaction to that part of the Carve the Mark controversy. I'm trying not to make these videos too long, but I'm going to make a second video. I have a second salvo of bile to head your way, so you can look forward to that. Thank you, Book 2.